Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. What would you do if an HOA president shut down your roof repair mid-job, then fined you every day while your house literally fills with rainwater? Because the color was slightly off? Yeah, I thought it was incompetence until I saw who benefited. This happened about 2 years ago, and I'm finally ready to share the whole crazy story. I still can't believe how far things went, but I guess that's what happens when you mess with the wrong person's dream home. My wife and I had been house hunting for almost 3 years. We're both in our early 30s, and we'd been saving every penny we could to buy our forever home. I work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company, so I know my way around buildings and regulations pretty well. My wife works in accounting at a local hospital. Between the two of us, we're pretty detail-oriented people who don't mess around when it comes to paperwork and doing things the right way. We found this amazing mid-century modern house in what seemed like a quiet, well-maintained neighborhood. The place was a bit of a fixer-upper, but that was perfect for us since we could put our own stamp on it and had the skills to handle most of the work ourselves. The lot was huge compared to everything else we'd looked at, almost half an acre with mature trees and this incredible view of the mountains in the distance. The moment we walked through that front door, we both knew this was it. The house had been on the market for a while because it needed some serious work. The roof was original from 1967 and desperately needed replacement. The previous owners had clearly been elderly and hadn't done much maintenance in the last decade. But we saw the potential, and more importantly, we could afford it after scraping together every dollar we had for the down payment. The neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association, which should have been my first red flag. But the current residents we talked to seemed happy enough, and the HOA fees weren't too unreasonable. The woman who showed us around mentioned that the HOA president was very thorough about maintaining property values, which sounded like a good thing at the time. That woman was the president herself, though I didn't know it then. Let me tell you about her. This lady was probably in her mid-60s, retired from some kind of auditing job, and she treated that neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. She had this way of talking that made everything sound like a friendly suggestion, but there was steel underneath every word. During our walkthrough, she mentioned how much she appreciated residents who took pride in their properties and followed all the community guidelines. What I didn't realize was that she had already decided we probably couldn't afford to maintain the property to her standards. She thought she was the only one who knew how to run a tight ship, and she was about to find out how wrong she was. We closed on the house in late spring, and I immediately started planning the necessary repairs. The roof was the top priority since we'd had a couple of small leaks during a storm right after we moved in. I pulled all the permits with the city, got 3 quotes from licensed contractors, and submitted everything to the HOA for approval just like the bylaws required. The architectural review process was supposed to take 30 days maximum according to their own rules. I submitted detailed plans, color samples, and even photos showing the existing damage to justify the urgency. Everything was by the book because that's how I operate, both at work and at home. The approval came back after exactly 29 days. Everything looked perfect. The roofing contractor I'd chosen was licensed, bonded, and had great references. We'd selected shingles that matched the approved color palette exactly, or so I thought. The work was scheduled to start the following Monday. My contractor showed up bright and early that first day with his crew. They spent the morning setting up scaffolding and protecting the landscaping. By lunch, they'd removed about half of the old shingles and were making good progress. I was at work but got regular photo updates showing everything going smoothly. Then around 2 p.m., I got a call from my contractor that I'll never forget. He sounded confused and frustrated. He told me that the HOA president had shown up with some kind of official-looking document saying the work had to stop immediately. She'd claimed the shingle color was wrong and that the approval was being revoked. I left work immediately and drove home to find my contractor and his crew just standing around looking bewildered. Half my roof was torn off, materials were everywhere, and there was this official-looking notice taped to my front door. The notice claimed that upon closer inspection, the shingle color was 1% off from the approved palette, and that the Architectural Review Board was revoking the permit effective immediately. The HOA president was still there when I arrived, standing in my driveway with a clipboard and measuring tape. She had this satisfied look on her face like she'd caught me trying to get away with something. When I approached her, she explained in that fake-friendly tone that the shingles I'd chosen were clearly not the approved color when viewed in natural sunlight. I pulled out my phone and showed her the exact color sample that had been approved, comparing it to the shingles. They looked identical to me, and my contractor agreed, but she insisted that the HOA board had the right to revoke any approval if the actual materials didn't match the submitted samples. The thing that really got to me was how she talked to me like I was some kind of scammer trying to pull a fast one on the neighborhood. She suggested that maybe I hadn't been able to afford the exact materials I'd proposed and had tried to substitute something cheaper. That comment really stung because we'd stretched our budget to the breaking point just to buy the house, and she seemed to know it. I asked her what I was supposed to do with half a roof torn off and weather forecasts showing rain for the next several days. She just shrugged and said that wasn't the HOA's problem. I should have gotten the materials pre-approved in person rather than just submitting photos. According to her, this was clearly stated in the architectural guidelines, though I'd read them 3 times and never saw any such requirement. My contractor was getting antsy because his crew was on the clock and the job was in limbo. I told him to pack up for the day while I figured out what was going on. As his truck pulled away, the HOA president handed me another document. This one informed me that I now had 48 hours to restore my property to compliance or face daily fines of $100. That night, my wife and I read through the entire HOA bylaws and architectural guidelines again. We could not find any requirement for in-person material approval. We also couldn't find any definition of what constituted a material difference in color. The approved sample and our actual shingles were so close that you'd need a magnifying glass to see any difference. I decided to be proactive and called an emergency meeting with the Architectural Review Board. According to the bylaws, any property owner could request such a meeting with 24 hours notice. I submitted my written request the next morning, including photos comparing the approved sample to our actual shingles. The response came back that same afternoon. The Architectural Review Board would meet the following week to consider my appeal. That was 6 days away, and I had a house with no roof. Sure enough, it rained that weekend. Not just a little drizzle, but a proper storm with driving rain that lasted most of Saturday night. Even though my contractor had done his best to tarp everything, water got into the house. We lost some drywall in the master bedroom and had to throw out a bunch of boxes we hadn't finished unpacking yet. I documented everything with photos and kept all the receipts for the emergency restoration work. This was going to be expensive, but I figured the HOA's insurance would cover it since they were the ones who'd forced us to stop work on a critical repair. Monday morning arrived, and with it came the first fine notice: $100 for non-compliance with architectural standards. The notice explained that each day the violation continued would result in an additional fine of the same amount. I called the HOA management company to explain the situation and ask about getting the damage covered. The woman I spoke to was sympathetic, but explained that the HOA's insurance only covered common areas, not individual properties. She suggested I file a claim with my homeowner's insurance and mentioned that the damage was caused by HOA action. My insurance company was not thrilled. They pointed out that I'd voluntarily stopped necessary repair work, which meant the damage might not be covered. I tried to explain about the HOA situation, but insurance agents aren't lawyers and they weren't going to make a coverage decision over the phone. The Architectural Review Board meeting finally happened the following Thursday. I showed up with my color samples, photos, and documentation proving that our materials matched the approved specifications. I expected a quick resolution and maybe an apology for the confusion. Instead, I walked into what felt like a trial. The HOA president sat at the head of the table with 2 other board members I'd never met. She had a thick folder in front of her and that same fake smile she'd worn in my driveway. She started by explaining that the board took architectural compliance very seriously because property values depended on maintaining consistent standards. Then she pulled out a professional color analysis that supposedly proved our shingles were outside the acceptable range. I have no idea where this analysis came from or who paid for it, but it looked official enough. According to this document, our shingles had a different undertone that became apparent in certain lighting conditions. The report concluded that the color difference would be noticeable to prospective buyers and could negatively impact property values throughout the neighborhood. When I tried to present my own evidence, the board chair cut me off. She explained that the architectural review process was not adversarial and that homeowners weren't expected to provide technical analysis. The board had consulted with qualified professionals and made their determination based on expert advice. I asked to see the names and credentials of these supposed experts. The board chair said that information was confidential but assured me that all proper procedures had been followed. She also mentioned that the daily fines would continue until the violation was corrected, and that additional penalties might apply if the situation dragged on much longer. As I sat there listening to this nonsense, something clicked in my brain. This wasn't about shingle colors or property values. This was about power and control. The HOA president had decided I didn't belong in her neighborhood, and she was going to use every bureaucratic trick in the book to make my life miserable until I gave up and moved away. But she had no idea who she was messing with. I spend my days managing complex construction projects with dozens of moving parts, strict timelines, and regulatory compliance requirements. I know how to read contracts, follow procedures, and document everything. If she wanted to play bureaucratic games, I was ready to show her how it's really done. That night, I started building what I called my master case file. Every document, every photo, every receipt, every communication with the HOA went into a chronological timeline. I also started recording every phone call and keeping detailed notes of every interaction. The fines kept coming, $100 per day, every single day, delivered by certified mail. After 2 weeks, I'd been fined $1,400 for having the wrong color shingles on my roof. The notices started including additional penalties for unpaid fines and administrative fees for the certified mail delivery. I tried calling the HOA president directly to work out some kind of resolution, but she never returned my calls. The management company said they were just following board directives and couldn't discuss specific cases. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of Kafka novel where the rules kept changing and no one would explain what I'd actually done wrong. 3 weeks after the initial stop work order, I received a notice that really got my attention. The HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines and fees totaling $2,100. The notice explained that this lien would be reported to credit agencies and could affect my ability to refinance or sell the property. I immediately called my mortgage company to give them a heads up about the situation. They were not happy to hear that there was already a lien on a property they'd just financed. The loan officer explained that HOA liens take priority over mortgage liens in many cases, and that they'd need to review my loan terms to see what options were available. 2 days later, my credit monitoring service sent me an alert that made my heart sink. My credit score had dropped 127 points overnight. The HOA had reported the unpaid fines as a delinquent debt to a collection agency, and that agency had reported it to all 3 credit bureaus. This was getting serious fast. My wife and I had worked for years to build excellent credit so we could qualify for our mortgage. Now our score was in the toilet because of a dispute over shingle colors that looked identical to the naked eye. I decided it was time to consult with a lawyer. I found an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and scheduled a consultation. He listened to my whole story and reviewed all my documentation. His assessment was both encouraging and terrifying. The good news was that the HOA had almost certainly overstepped their authority. The color difference was so minor that it probably wouldn't hold up to legal scrutiny, and their process for revoking an approved permit seemed questionable. The bad news was that fighting it would cost thousands of dollars in legal fees, and HOAs have broad powers that make them difficult to challenge. He also explained something that chilled me to the bone. In our state, HOAs can foreclose on properties for unpaid assessments and fines through a non-judicial process. That means they don't need to go to court or prove their case to a judge. If the debt reaches a certain threshold and remains unpaid for a specific period, they can literally auction off your house to pay the debt. The attorney estimated that my legal fees would run between $8,000 and $12,000 if we had to go to trial. He could probably get the fines dismissed and the lien removed, but it would take months and there was no guarantee the HOA would pay my attorney fees even if I won. I went home that night feeling defeated. We'd put every penny we had into buying this house, and now we were facing thousands in legal bills to fight what seemed like a completely frivolous dispute. My wife was starting to panic, wondering if we should just pay the fines and move on, but something the attorney had said stuck with me. He'd mentioned that HOA boards have to follow their own bylaws and that violations of proper procedure could invalidate their actions. That got me thinking about all the documentation I'd been collecting. I pulled out the HOA bylaws and started reading them more carefully than I ever had before. These weren't just guidelines, they were legal requirements that the board had to follow. And as I read through them with fresh eyes, I started noticing some interesting details. For example, the bylaws required that architectural review decisions be made by a majority vote of the three-person committee. But all my communications had come from just the HOA president. There was no mention of the other committee members or any record of a formal vote. The bylaws also required that all fines be assessed according to a published schedule and that property owners be given written notice of the specific violation and an opportunity to cure it before any penalties were imposed. The stop work order had been immediate with no cure period, and the fine schedule I'd been sent didn't match what was published in the official bylaws. Most interesting of all, the bylaws required that any decisions affecting individual properties be made during properly noticed board meetings with a quorum present. I'd never received notice of any such meetings, and I started to wonder if they were actually happening. This was where my project management background really came in handy. I know how to trace paper trails and identify process failures. If the HOA wasn't following their own procedures, then their actions might be completely invalid. I decided to invoke a provision in the bylaws that I'd overlooked before. Section 12.3 gave any homeowner the right to inspect all HOA records during normal business hours. This included meeting minutes, financial records, correspondence, and any documents related to enforcement actions. I submitted my written request the next morning, citing the specific bylaw section and requesting access to all records related to my case as well as general board meeting minutes for the past year. The bylaws required a response within 5 business days. The response came back exactly 5 days later. The HOA management company would provide access to the records, but I'd have to pay copying fees and could only review them at their office during specific hours. They also mentioned that some records might be confidential or privileged and therefore not available for inspection. I took a day off work and drove to the management company's office with a portable scanner and several boxes of file folders. If they wanted to play games with copying fees, I'd make sure I got every single document I was entitled to see. What I found in those records was absolutely shocking. The Architectural Review Committee hadn't held a single meeting in over 8 months. Every decision that had supposedly been made by the committee had actually been made unilaterally by the HOA president. She'd been rubber stamping her own decisions and signing other board members' names to official documents. Even more disturbing were the financial records. The HOA was supposed to maintain separate accounts for operating expenses, reserve funds, and legal expenses. But money was being moved between accounts with no clear documentation, and several large payments had been made to companies I'd never heard of. I spent 6 hours in that office scanning every document I could get my hands on. By the time I left, I had over 400 pages of records that painted a very different picture of how the HOA was actually being run. That night, I started building spreadsheets to track everything I'd found. The more I dug into the data, the more obvious it became that something was seriously wrong with the HOA's operations. For starters, the board hadn't held a proper meeting with a quorum present in almost 2 years. According to the bylaws, a quorum required at least 2 of the 3 board members to be present. But the meeting minutes showed that most meetings were just the president and 1 other person, and several meetings had no attendance records at all. Without a valid quorum, none of the board's decisions were legally binding. That included not just my case, but every fine, every architectural decision, and every expense approval for the past 2 years. The whole operation was essentially invalid, but the financial irregularities were even more concerning. The HOA had been charging homeowners for legal expenses related to enforcement actions, but those expenses were being paid to a company that shared an address with the HOA president's business. I couldn't prove it yet, but it looked like she might be paying herself to pursue cases against homeowners. There were also some questionable patterns in how fines were being assessed. Certain properties seemed to get violations for minor issues that were ignored at other houses, and the fines were always just high enough to justify placing liens and reporting to credit agencies. As I put together this evidence, a picture started to emerge of a corrupt HOA president who was essentially running a protection racket in our neighborhood. She was using her position to harass homeowners she didn't like, extract money through questionable fines, and possibly funnel that money to her own companies. The question was what to do about it. I could take all this evidence to my attorney and probably get my own case dismissed, but that wouldn't stop her from doing the same thing to other homeowners. And it definitely wouldn't repair the damage she'd already done to my credit and my bank account. I needed a strategy that would not only solve my immediate problem, but also ensure this couldn't happen to anyone else. and I needed to do it in a way that would be so public and so devastating that she'd never be able to abuse her power again. That's when I remembered something the HOA president had said during my architectural review hearing. She'd mentioned that the next annual homeowners meeting was coming up in a few weeks. According to the bylaws, this was the one meeting each year where all residents could attend and vote on major issues. I started planning what I privately called Operation Transparency. Instead of fighting the HOA in court or through lawyers, I was going to present all my evidence directly to the entire neighborhood at the annual meeting. Let every homeowner see exactly how their HOA was being run and decide for themselves what to do about it. The annual meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community center. According to the posted agenda, the main items were approving the annual budget, electing board members, and hearing the president's State of the Neighborhood report. I had 2 weeks to prepare, and I used every minute of it. I organized all my evidence into a clear, compelling presentation that any homeowner could understand. I created charts showing the financial irregularities, timelines showing the procedural violations, and side-by-side comparisons showing how different properties were treated for similar violations. I also did something that would prove to be the key to everything that followed. I purchased a small digital recorder and started carrying it with me whenever I was in the neighborhood. I wasn't trying to secretly record anyone, but I wanted to be ready if the HOA president said something revealing. My patience paid off the weekend before the annual meeting. I was outside working on some landscaping when the HOA president walked by with one of my neighbors. They were clearly talking about the meeting, and the president was explaining how she expected it to go. What I heard made my blood boil. She told my neighbor that she was looking forward to the meeting because it would be a good opportunity to discuss problems with certain residents who weren't maintaining their properties appropriately. She specifically mentioned that some people had moved into the neighborhood who couldn't really afford to maintain the standards everyone else expected. Then she said something that I knew would be the smoking gun I needed. She mentioned that she had already spoken to a potential buyer for my house who would be interested in purchasing it at the foreclosure auction if things continued to escalate. This buyer happened to be her nephew, who was looking for a good investment property. She hadn't realized I was close enough to hear every word, and I had it all recorded on my device. Not only was she admitting that the whole situation was designed to force me out of my home, but she was planning to profit from it by having a family member buy my house at a discount. The night of the annual meeting, I arrived early with my laptop, a portable projector, and several printed copies of my key evidence. The community center was set up with about 60 chairs, and I was hoping for a good turnout. The HOA president was clearly not expecting any trouble. She had her usual clipboard and fake smile, and she'd prepared what seemed like a standard feel-good presentation about property values and community pride. The other 2 board members were there as well, though they looked like they were just along for the ride. As residents started arriving, I realized that a lot of people had stories about problems with the HOA. Several neighbors came up to me and mentioned issues they'd had with arbitrary fines, rejected architectural requests, and poor communication from the board. I wasn't the only one who'd been frustrated with how things were being run. The meeting started with the president's State of the Neighborhood report. She talked about how property values had remained stable, how the neighborhood maintained its reputation as a desirable place to live, and how the board had worked hard to ensure consistent enforcement of community standards. Then she opened the floor for questions and comments from residents. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I stood up and asked if I could share some concerns about HOA governance and financial management. The president looked a little annoyed but agreed to give me 5 minutes to speak. That was all the time I needed. I plugged my laptop into the projector and started with the recording I'd made. The room went completely silent as they heard the HOA president's own voice explaining how she wanted certain residents to leave and how her nephew was ready to buy my house at auction. Then I showed the spreadsheets documenting the financial irregularities, the meeting minutes proving that no valid quorum had existed for 2 years, and the evidence that all the fines and liens imposed on various properties were legally invalid. The reaction from the other homeowners was immediate and intense. People started asking angry questions about their own fines and assessments. Several residents mentioned that they'd been charged legal fees for enforcement actions and wanted to know if those charges were legitimate. The HOA president tried to maintain control, claiming that my presentation contained false information and that all board actions had been properly authorized. But when multiple homeowners started demanding to see the financial records and meeting minutes for themselves, her position became impossible to defend. One of the other board members, who clearly hadn't known about most of what I'd presented, stood up and announced his resignation effective immediately. He said he'd never been informed about most of the decisions made in his name and that he wasn't comfortable being associated with the current board leadership. At that point, the meeting basically devolved into chaos. Homeowners were shouting questions, demanding refunds, and calling for the president's resignation. Several people mentioned that they were going to contact attorneys about getting their fines reversed and their credit reports corrected. The HOA president tried to adjourn the meeting, but under the bylaws, she couldn't do that without a majority vote of the board. With one member having resigned and the other clearly not supporting her, she no longer had the authority to control the meeting. A motion was made to remove the president from office immediately and appoint an interim board to clean up the mess. The vote was 37 in favor and only 2 opposed. The HOA president had been effectively fired by her own neighborhood. But I wasn't done yet. I stood up again and announced that I had one more item to address. I explained that all the fines and liens imposed over the past 2 years were legally invalid due to the lack of valid quorum for board meetings. I suggested that the new interim board's first priority should be reversing all those actions and making sure everyone's credit reports were corrected. I also mentioned that the questionable financial transactions I'd documented should probably be reviewed by a forensic accountant to determine if any laws had been broken. Several homeowners volunteered to contribute to the cost of such an investigation. The meeting finally ended after nearly 3 hours, but the real action was just beginning. Over the next several weeks, the interim board worked with attorneys to unwind 2 years of invalid HOA decisions. Every fine was reversed, every lien was removed, and every homeowner who'd been affected got letters for their credit files documenting the errors. The forensic accounting investigation confirmed what I'd suspected. The former HOA president had been funneling legal fees and other expenses to companies she owned or had financial interests in. The total amount was over $40,000 that needed to be returned to the HOA. Rather than face criminal charges, she agreed to pay back the money and resign from all positions related to neighborhood governance. She also had to sell her house to cover the restitution, which meant she was the one who ended up being forced out of the neighborhood. My credit score was fully restored within 60 days once the erroneous information was removed from my credit reports. The HOA also paid for all the storm damage repairs to my house and covered my legal consultation fees as part of the settlement. But the most satisfying part was finally getting my roof finished. The new board approved my original shingle choice within 24 hours, and my contractor had the work completed in just 2 days. The shingles that had caused all the trouble look absolutely perfect, and I've gotten multiple compliments from neighbors about how great the house looks. As I write this, it's been almost 2 years since that annual meeting, and the neighborhood is running much more smoothly under new leadership. The new board actually follows the bylaws, holds regular meetings with proper notice, and treats homeowners with respect rather than suspicion. The former president's house sold at a significant loss because of all the negative publicity about the HOA scandal. Meanwhile, my property value has increased substantially, both because of the improvements I was finally able to complete and because the neighborhood is no longer under the control of a petty tyrant. I learned a lot from this whole experience about the importance of understanding your rights and standing up to abuse of power. HOAs can provide valuable services to neighborhoods, but they need proper oversight and accountability to prevent corruption. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best way to fight bureaucratic bullying is with better bureaucracy. The former HOA president thought she could use rules and procedures as weapons against homeowners she didn't like. But rules work both ways, and when you actually follow them properly, they protect honest people from abuse. The moral of the story is that you should never let anyone intimidate you with official-sounding documents and fake authority. Do your homework, document everything, and don't be afraid to shine a light on corruption when you find it. Sometimes the bullies are counting on you being too scared or too tired to fight back. But in my case, they picked the wrong guy to mess with. I didn't just take back control of my situation, I took back control of my entire neighborhood. And now everyone can enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary harassment from power-hungry board members. The best part is sitting on my beautiful new roof deck on summer evenings watching the sunset over the mountains, knowing that I fought for my dream home and won. That's a feeling no amount of money can buy, and it was worth every hour I spent building the case that brought down a corrupt HOA president. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And sometimes the smart way is the only way that actually works. I'm proud of how I handled this situation, and I'm proud to live in a neighborhood where homeowners look out for each other instead of trying to tear each other down. If you're dealing with a similar situation, don't give up and don't let anyone convince you that you're powerless. Get organized, get informed, and get ready to fight back. The bullies are counting on you to be too intimidated to challenge them, but they're usually not as powerful as they pretend to be. In the end, justice prevailed, my credit was restored, my dream home was saved, and the neighborhood is better off without its former dictator. That's what I call taking back control the smart way. The next one is a malicious compliance story. For the last 10 years, I've been working from home as automation engineer for a relatively small company what produced custom-built industrial gas treatment units, industrial chillers, compressor stations, that sort of thing. My job was to write algorithms for PLCs, design HMI, and setting up data transfer for customers' SCADA systems. Basically, I was the person who told machines what to do. I was getting significant below-market pay for such position, but with only 4 to 5 projects per year and each taking me 2 to 3 weeks to complete, I wasn't arguing, since I was getting paid for mostly doing nothing, and I was fortunate enough to have considerable passive income thanks to lucky investments of my inheritance. Everything was great until a couple years ago when owner decided to retire and sold the company. So here comes new management with new policies. In my country, every worker entitled to at least 4 weeks of paid vacation time per year, all unspent vacation is rolled other to the next year, but you have to take at least 2 uninterrupted weeks per year. So if you only take your mandatory vacation, you accumulate 14 additional days per year. Given how much free time I actually had, I rarely used more than mandatory 2 weeks per year, always making sure there be no commissioning or maintenance planned during my vacation. During these events, I would remotely access maintenance engineer's laptop to make necessary adjustments to the algorithms so everything works perfectly in real working conditions. But one of the first policies new management implemented was schedule-based vacations. So now O had to decide when I take my 2 weeks at the start of the year. I chose first weeks of April. In early March, I get a call from manager of the development team who asks me to come on a quick 3-day work trip to help maintenance engineer switch PLC and upload new project. Apparently, thanks to new maintenance team manager, a lot of maintenance engineers quit and they are short-stuffed, and the only one they can send ATM is bad with computer. Where isn't much for me to do since we had identical station going through the same PLC switch month prior, so I'll just fly there, chill until electrical panel is rewired, new PLC is installed when I just upload new project to PLC and fly home. I thought for myself and agreed to go. Apparently, maintenance engineer not only bad with computers, but also knows nothing about electrical work, so I had to do everything myself, which I am not actually qualified to do. But at this point, I don't want to disappoint client, who turned out to be a bunch of really nice people, so after a week and with only 3 burned down fuses, I finished. After returning home, I inform my manager what I am not going to any more business trips since I don't get paid enough to also do maintenance engineer's work. First day of my vacation comes and I get another call. Despite my poor judgment, I decided to answer. Hey, we need 2 to go on another business trip starting next Monday. It will just take a week, for this project. I'm not familiar with that project. It was done while I was on paternity leave. In my country, either parent can take paternity/maternity leave up to 3 years, and after first 6 months, my wife asked me to switch. Yeah, we had to contract a specialist to do that project while you were on leave. I'll send it to you along with documentation right away. Disconnects I check, received project, and it is huge. 7 PLCs, 6 HMI panels, everything has to work as a single system, and project is a total mess. Nothing would work. You just has to do everything from scratch. Will probably take me close to a month to finish. And that is with doing everything from comfort of my own home, where I am more productive. So I call back, yeah, I looked at this project and that's a mess. It's not in the working condition and no way to finish it in a week. I'll do what I can do, but as I said last time, I'm doing it remotely. As always, I won't go on another business trip, especially now I have many things planned for the next few weeks I can't go. But reception on site is terrible. You won't be able to access it remotely, and we already missed all deadlines on this project. Client is pissed, and we are looking at huge fines. CEO is breathing down my neck. We need it fixed yesterday. Then I'll email maintenance engineer project with changes each evening once he is in hotel with decent reception, and he can email me list of things, what need fixing. It's not the first time we done it that way. Okay, I hear you, I'll have to speak with CEO about. About 15 minutes later, I get another call. CEO said, what if you don't want to go? You should just write a resignation letter. I am the only employee who knows how to do my job. But yeah, sure, I'll send my resignation letter right away. I was thinking about not doing it, so they had to terminate me and pay me termination compensation. But when I decided to be petty in a different way, in my country you had to give at least 2 weeks' notice, unless both parties agreed a shorter notice. So I write my letter and set my resignation day as 14th of April, which is 2 weeks. Shortly after it gets approved, did is done. And I get another call a bit later. So will you be able to finish this project before you leave? I won't be able to do any work on that project before I leave. What? Why? You still have 2 weeks and we really need it done. Well, you see, I am on vacation right now. Last day of my vacation will be April 13th and I am resigning on 14th. Fallout. I recently got a message from ex-colleague I have friendly relationship with. Apparently they are in deep crap right now. Deadlines were missed, fines rolled in, and companies' accounts have been frozen. They even were unable to pay salaries for the last 2 months. They are probably toast, and if things go that way, they'll have to file bankruptcy. Don't worry, people will get paid in the end. In my country, salary debts have the highest priority when bankrupt business sell their assets. Downside, I still haven't received my compensation for my 120 saved vacation days. Anyway, thank you for watching.